Good morning and welcome to New Hope Church. Today we'll be ending our time with the book of Daniel by reading chapters 11 and 12. If you remember last week, we read chapter 10, which was an introduction to the final of three prophecies or visions. This week, our chapters convey the vision, and the book concludes with the conversation between Daniel and two supernatural beings. And I must tell you that this is one of my favorite passages in Scripture, and it is definitely my favorite part of the book. There is drama in these two chapters. There are majestic poetic words. There is judgment, and there is also tremendous hope for Christians. Now, this prophecy is most likely written after the fact and conforms closely to what we know actual history to be. It does not conform perfectly, but in general, it follows actual history. The lack of congruity is probably due to the time in which it was written. Communication and record keeping was, of course, not as comprehensive as it is today. You think about the ancient world, how slowly news traveled. There were really not ways like we have today of recording information and saving it for posterity in the same way. Now, many refuse to think of this as anything other than actual prophecy, but the fact is it was not at all unusual to write prophecy after the fact in the literature of the ancient Near East. The author would not have been trying to deceive, but rather to convey a message. The emphasis should not be on the history itself, as I've said before, but rather it should be on what the story is telling us about God and our relationship to God. As the story wraps up, we are reminded of the great themes and the theological takeaways. No matter how difficult a situation may be, God is in control. That's our first theological takeaway. We've heard that every single week. Second, God does not allow his people to suffer indefinitely. And last, there really is a battle between good and evil, chaos and order. God has triumphed in the grand scheme, but here, during our time on earth, we still have to deal with this battle in our everyday existence. We know that evil really does exist. And so our story today is divided into three parts. Let's take a look at part number one.
So part two harkens back to a previous chapter. If you remember, we had the ram and the goat, that vision. And we said that the ram had two horns, one of which represented the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had several kings: Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, and Darius III. Now, Darius III was defeated, and the Persian Empire was defeated by the Greeks, and the Greeks were led by what our passage today calls the mighty king, and that would be Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander didn't live to be very old. He was cut off very quickly. All his heirs were killed or dead, and so 4 of his generals divided up the kingdom. Now, this isn't Greek history that we're worried about, so we're not going to pay attention to these branches, but we are going to pay attention to these 2 branches. One became the northern kingdom spoken of in our passage today, and the other became the southern kingdom spoken of in our passage today. Now, what we're concerned about is Judah, because Judah was between these 2, and Judah, of course, is God's people, the Israelites. The northern kingdom had a Syrian power base, and they were called the Seleucids. The southern kingdom had an Egyptian power base. Oops, there we go. And they were called the Ptolemies. What is described in our passage is this punting back and forth of God's people between this northern and southern kingdom over and over and over again. So that's what we're going to be reading about in part 2.
We have 3 parts to our reading today. Part 1 is by far the longest, so please try to pay attention to the story here. It's really quite exciting. Chapter 11, verse 1. And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Now then, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because in his empire will be uprooted and given to others. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be betrayed together with her royal escort and her father and those who supported her. One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold and carry them off to Egypt. For some years, he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. The king of the north will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years, he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. In those times, many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and he will take many of them. But a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more. His successors will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people, he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute, plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The 2 kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastland will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of the Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all of the riches of Egypt, the Libyans and the Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Part one was quite long, and it describes this punting back and forth of Judah, the Israelites, back and forth between these northern and southern powers. But as we look at part two, we're given a powerful sense of hope, because part two foreshadows the New Testament and Jesus's promises of life after death and the bodily resurrection. We are told in this very short passage that the end of history will be violent, there will be judgment, the righteous will be given over to a new life with God, and the wicked will be met with punishment. So let's read that now. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. Finally, in part three, we end at the river with two supernatural beings. Daniel wants to know when these things that have been foretold will pass, and he is told that only God knows. God controls all of history, and all will turn out right in the end. This knowledge should lead to joy in the present. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, "How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled?" The man, clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. And I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, it will be for a time, times and a half a time. When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. I heard, but I did not understand, so I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? He replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. And that is the end of chapter 12 and the end of the book of Daniel. As we end, I want to remind you that we do have struggles in this life. We have all sorts of struggles. We have relational struggles, cultural struggles, emotional struggles, psychological struggles, physical struggles, and political struggles. Many of us struggle with monetary issues. And the book of Ecclesiastes reflects this. Ecclesiastes says, the race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise or wealth to the brilliant or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. Moreover, no man knows when his hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, birds are taken in a snare, so men are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. Despite these struggles that all face, the overarching message is that God is indeed in control. In our modern world, that message is often laughed at. Christians are often scoffed at for believing in the sovereignty of God. And this makes me sad because so many cut themselves off from God's sovereignty and salvation, and they replace that with their own extreme autonomy. Many scoff at a higher power, but the truth is life is a delicate balance between God's sovereignty and our own responsibility. Now, this is important to understand because many feel that if we embrace God's sovereignty, we are merely his puppets. But of course, scripture shows that is not the case, that the reality is something quite the opposite. God gives his people a responsibility, but God also gives his people the ability to make choices. Our actions are not meaningless. Sometimes our actions lead to good things, and at other times they lead to bad outcomes or poor consequences. But what Ecclesiastes also tells us is that life is quite unfair. But then again, God never promised that it would be fair for Christians or non-Christians. In the end, Christians know that there is something greater and better, and that it's coming in their future. So as the two supernatural beings remind Daniel, go your way, follow God until your end comes. And at that time, you will rest and then rise to a great and promised inheritance. So I just want to say to you that this is a fitting conclusion for Daniel and for the book as a whole. You may suffer now, but God has given you a glimpse of the coming glory. So New Hope, I'll see you in 2 weeks with something entirely new. We're going to be doing something very, very different, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. But for next week, Dr. Rob Lauder will be here to do a recap of Daniel. Thanks so much for being with us. Goodbye.